This is 2024's Killer Heat. Warning, spoilers ahead. The story starts with a man scaling a sheer rock wall and he ends up falling to his death. Shortly after that, a funeral is held for the man and we see his twin brother Elias working with Penelope. Nick reads about the tragic event while he flies to Crete and he's clearly dealing with his own personal issues. Nick mentions that Penelope is the one who sent for him and she meets him just outside of the airport. She admits that her husband's family doesn't know anything about this, and she can't trust them since they own the police force. She thinks that Leo was murdered, and she wants Nick to figure it all out for her. She thinks that she owes this to Leo, and she tells Nick that no one can know that he's working for her. This seems like it might be a little bit over his head since he pretty much just focuses on cheating spouses and tiny private eye stuff. This is like a bad James Bond setup. Penelope takes Nick to a small monastery nearby where he can stay, and he couldn't be more unhappy about being stuck in a religious place. After Nick is shown to his room, the first thing that he does is open up the liquor bottle that he packed with him. He immediately thinks back to memories of his family that he clearly wishes to forget. The next day, Nick heads into town to get a feel for the area, and he checks into the medical department to go over the autopsy report. Nick gets the name of the investigating officer, and he heads to the police station to talk to Georges. Georges tries to play things safe, but Nick can tell that he suspects something else since he was at the funeral with a camera. Nick is pretty quick, but Georges is a closed book. For this being a closed case, he sure does have a lot of coincidental evidence and pictures up on his corkboard. Nick spots the family yacht on the board, and he goes to the harbor to spy on the family. No one in the family is happy with their life, but he noticed Elias was the most unhappy of the lot. Elias makes his way to shore, and Nick does his best to keep up with him in his supercar. They end up at a rock climbing cliff, and Nick watches as Elias free climbs just like his dead brother died doing. The two of them head to a coffee shop when Elias is done, and Nick tries to get some info out of him. What he doesn't see is Georges listening in on their conversation. During the conversation, Elias gets an anonymous text telling him that Nick isn't who he says he is, and after Elias leaves, Nick manages to spot Georges spying on them. Well, at least he has one ally, finally. It wasn't that hard to convince Georges since he was just playing hardball with the evidence a little bit earlier. Nick and Georges definitely think Elias is hiding something, but Nick is called back to the monastery to meet with Penelope. She is furious that he spoke with Elias before speaking to her about it, but he turns the conversation around to see how she knew the dead brother before Elias, her husband. Penelope and Leo had a history from their university years, but when Nick asks about how she met Elias, she shuts the conversation down. After Penelope leaves, Nick thought back to how he killed his marriage with jealousy, and he continues to drink in his room. After taking a moment, Nick heads to Leo's apartment to dig around, and Leo clearly still had a thing for Penelope as he had pictures of her tucked away. Then, Nick finds pictures of Victoria, Leo's friend outside of the family, and he heads to a beachside bar to question her. Nick is not subtle with his prodding around, and he just comes right out to everyone he questions. Victoria didn't even try to hide anything, though. Finally, someone who cooperates. Victoria mentions that the family thought Leo was weak, but she thinks he was the strongest one and Elias is actually the terrible man. She admits that Leo had feelings for Penelope and she had her own jealous feelings. Victoria mentions that Elias ran the family company, but Audrey, the mother, runs everything in the family. She feels as though something is wrong with the situation though, since Leo had been climbing that rock ever since he was a boy. Later, Penelope takes Nick to the location of Leo's death, and while there, she finally opens up about how Elias managed to get her attention. Elias posed as Leo one night in Penelope's dorm, and they got it on. Is that a crime or something? Pleasure under false pretenses? After graduation, Elias introduces Penelope to the rest of the family, and Leo continues to watch them from the shadows. Nick wants to question Audrey, but Penelope doesn't think that he'll ever be able to get anything out of her. She agrees to get him on the list for the private event on the yacht that night, and she sends him a suit. Once Nick gets on the yacht, he corners Audrey at the bar, but Elias puts a stop to all lines of questioning and kicks him off the boat with one final threat. Nick naturally goes to a hotel bar to drink, and Georges lets him know that he can't help him anymore now. After Georges leaves, we get to see just how badly Nick handled his wife cheating on him, and I'm starting to think that the monastery is exactly where Nick needs to be. Speaking of that, the monks deliver him fresh brewed coffee in the mornings. Nick goes to see Victoria again, but he finds that the entire bar has been shut down by the police. So he heads to the estate to spy on the family. He finds Penelope swimming at the pool and Elias arguing with Audrey before going to the safe. Nick tails Elias through the night, and Georges joins him in his own car. Elias ends up going to a club to pay a man, and he and his men beat up on Nick to get some answers of their own. Elias gives him one last warning to leave the island or they'll kill him next. Once Elias is through with Nick, Georges shows up and helps him back to the monastery. The next day, Penelope meets with Nick to thank him for not blowing her cover, and she gets a good look at what Elias did to him the night before. While they talk, Penelope mentions that she's wanted to leave Elias for quite some time, but he always threatens to kill her if she does. Nick finally calls Penelope out on having an affair with Leo since he found her hair tie at his apartment, and now Nick doesn't know who he can really trust. Why hire this guy and not tell him your whole side of the story? Now she's a questionable suspect too! Nick figures out that whoever killed Leo had to get to the spot by boat, and he thinks that the local fisherman might help him out. Later, Nick calls Georges for a favor, and he lets him know that Penelope is the one who hired him. He asks for info on potential fishermen who would have been around the island at the time of Leo's death, and they end up spotting a suspicious boat. Nick goes to investigate the boat, but none of the local men know anything about it. Georges calls him to let him know Elias's lackey is shipping the boat out that night, and the two of them stake out the docks that night. Soon, the boat shows up, and Nick hops on to look around. Meanwhile, Georges is getting shot at and taking all of the risk. No! Georges! Even his dog is upset. Nick takes his weapon to handle the last lackey, and he clears the dock. After getting rid of the weapon, Nick goes back to Georges to check on him, but he's too late. After this, Nick prays at the monastery and drinks his sorrows away again as he remembers how he failed his wife with his jealousy and suspicions. Nick thinks that he's figured something out though, and he heads back to the island where Leo died. After piecing some things together, Nick calls Penelope to let her know he's coming over, and he gives her specific instructions about letting the security detail go. Meanwhile, Audrey can tell that something is wrong, and she grabs a weapon out of her nightstand. This is about to get really dirty. Everyone seems like they know 2 steps more than Nick, but I'm sure we're about to find out the truth. Or at least some of it. Nick faces Elias, and he tells the family that this version of Elias is actually Leo. Nick breaks down the whole scheme, and it's all true. Leo killed Elias and took his place as Penelope's husband since jealousy is what drove him this whole time. Essentially, Elias told on himself the very first time that he spoke with Nick, but Audrey has had enough of this. She puts 2 rounds in his chest. Soon, the police arrive to take away Leo's body and arrest Audrey, and Nick goes back to the monastery to pack his things. Nick hops on an airplane back home, and he seems to be done with drinking now that he's found some peace with the case. He realizes that everything Penelope hated about Elias is all too similar to his ex-wife, and something else clicks. Nick leaves the plane in a hurry to speak with Penelope one more time, and he calls her out for being Leo's accomplice. She admits to helping Leo kill Elias so she could be free of him, but she didn't realize that Leo was going to change the plan after the deed was done. Penelope was in way too deep from the get-go, and she ended up with 2 crazy jealous twin brothers. How else do you get out of that? Once Penelope confesses everything, Nick grabs his bag and starts to leave, but Penelope wants to know what happens next. He tells her that she's earned her freedom at this point, but she wants to know what he did with his own wife. He admits that he wanted to kill her and the man she'd been seeing, but when he almost went through with it, his daughter saw him and he decided to run away instead. Penelope explains that he still has the option to go back to his daughter at least, and she drives him to the dock. While on the boat, Nick decides to call home, and he asks to talk to his daughter. Once he hears her voice, he smiles and tells her that he's coming home. Then the credits roll. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more like this one. Comment what you think I should watch next, and I'll see you in the next video.